Good morning. Welcome to the Humanist community in Silicon Valley's Sunday Forum. My name is Matt Courtney, and I'm the recorder and a member of the board of the Humanist community. The Humanist community is a chapter of the American Humanist Association. Humanism is a reality-based philosophy of life that affirms our ability and responsibility to lead ethical lives of personal fulfillment that aspire to the greater good. We value freedom, health, happiness, fairness, compassion, and using science and reason to acquire and apply knowledge. If these words describe your thinking, we invite you to become a member of the Humanist community if you have not already done so. Membership forms are available on our website at humanist.org. That's humanists plural. If you are listening for the first time, welcome, and we invite you to continue listening to our weekly forums and other events. You can find all our events listed on the website, humanist.org. Please aid us in continuing to present these forums by donating to the Humanist community. You can find out how to donate to our organization on the website, again, humanist.org. So the topic of the forum today will be the inevitable but necessary conflict between democracy and market economics and how it's failing in the United States. Which will be presented by Ms Yordy. Jill is a third-year PhD student at the University of Colorado, Denver's School of Public Affairs. She is currently researching policy conflicts surrounding energy infrastructure, sitting decisions, public participation, and democracy. Her talk will cover an overview of democratic theory, market economic theory, and her thoughts on why American political system is currently deeply out of balance. So, Jill, take it away. You're unmuted.
Great. Thank you guys so much for having me to speak and allowing me the opportunity to share this presentation. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and get my PowerPoint started. And I don't rely on this a ton, so I don't have a huge amount of slides, but there are a few things that I wanted to illustrate and have something for you guys to look at and read while I'm talking. So I'm a third-year PhD student, just about to start my third year of the PhD program at CU Denver in the School of Public Affairs. And my research interests in the academic world include democracy, public participation, policy conflict, and social equity. So things that very closely relate to, I think, the humanist approach or ideals. And these research interests for me come from a foundational commitment to some of the ideals of democracy and concerns related to structural inequities that really developed in me before I started diving into the academic literature related to democracy. I have a primarily practitioner background in the realm of public affairs, and this started when I was the program director at the Northern Alaska Environmental Center working on clean water and mining issues. Then I worked as a case manager for a nonprofit program working to help 18 to 24-year-olds struggling with mental health issues learn skills that they needed to become more independent. Following that, I served as the state director for Bernie Sanders' 2016 presidential run in Alaska. And after that, I took on a job as a legislative aide for a state house representative working for one of the most rural and poor districts in the state of Alaska. And all of these experiences gave me kind of a well-rounded view of some of the structural failings of our society that led to really massive inequalities and barriers that prevented people from adequately participating in both the economy, but also in our system of governance. So the goals of this talk, I have a few of them. First, I'll explore the theoretical tenets that underlie the concepts of democracy and market economics, and specifically market capitalism. And then I want to go over the tempestuous relationship that exists between these two concepts, particularly in the societal context of the United States. And this talk really is going to stay at a pretty high level, and I won't dive too deep into the weeds of examples. But I do hope that everyone is familiar with at least some of these. For example, the growing wealth gap between rich and poor in this country, also globally, but for the purposes of this talk, in the United States. There's the increasing mismatch between the need for public safety nets and the inadequate capacity of these in society. This ranges from food banks to homeless shelters, free or affordable legal aid, mental health services for the poor. And then another example is systemic racism, and this one is particularly salient in our society today with all of the protests that have been going on. And this is characterized by things like the much higher rates of incarceration for Blacks and other people of color, redlining practices that have excluded marginalized communities from accumulating wealth, and a failure to recognize the impact of historic realities on modern economic outcomes. Then towards the end of the talk, I'll share my thoughts on where we might go from here, the kinds of questions that we need to be asking and answering about the conflict between democracy and market economics in order to work towards a better and more just society where the ideals of both may potentially be realized. So first, I will also say that my talk may not last as long as normal because I find that some of the most productive ideas about these concepts actually come from discussion. And so I'm really excited about that part of this event. So first I'll start by talking about what is democracy. And there's a number of different public and academic definitions of this and different manifestations of it. And so first, the linguistic roots of democracy come from the Greek words demos, which means people, and kratos, which means to rule. So literally, the people rule, or the rule of the people. And this democracy was the method of governance in Athens for centuries. In Rome, a similar governance arrangement emerged and was referred to as a republic, which comes from the Latin words res, which is a thing of, and publicus, which is public. So loosely translated, it means that a republic is a thing that belongs to the people. In the United States context, these two terms, though they mean very similar things from a linguistic standpoint, our conceptualization of them was muddled by James Madison in 1787, when he wrote that a pure democracy, by which I mean a society consisting of a small number of citizens who assemble and administer the government in person, and a republic, by which I mean a government in which the scheme of representation exists. So here Madison kind of conflated the two, and really this is where we see a divergence in the terms. So one of the manifestations of democracy is direct or assembly democracy. This is where we have the idea that citizens or the public of a state, and a state can mean a city, a country, or kind of any level of governance there, that the people have control over the laws that they live by. In Athenian democracy, any citizen, and means male citizen at the time, could be selected for a term of public service through a lottery in which each person had an equal chance of selection. There are some problems with direct democracy in that it doesn't scale well with size. We see this both in geographic size and in terms of population size. So when a country or a governance structure gets so big geographically that people throughout the area can't actually meet in person to determine the laws, it creates real barriers to entry where people living farther from the point of assembly are much less likely to be able to participate. Similarly, with the size of population, the bigger the population is, the greater the logistical challenges there are to really incorporating everybody into these decisions about what laws they live under. Which brings us to representative democracy, which is the idea that the will of the people is enacted by representatives of the people as the system of governance. And so that's what we have in this country, where we have this idea that our elected officials will enact laws that represent or reflect our views and work towards the betterment of society. society as a whole. And I think Seymour Martin Lipset expressed this well in his 1959 article, Some Social Requisites of Democracy, Economic Development and Political Legitimacy. And he said, democracy in a complex society may be defined as a political system which supplies regular constitutional opportunities for changing the governing officials and a social mechanism which permits for political office. And this kind of brings us to what Aachen and Martels have referred to as the folk theory of democracy. And this is a very condensed, simplified version of what democracy is, and it's probably the one most people are most familiar with. And it's the idea that democracy begins with elections. People vote for candidates who will best enact the policies that they want. And the result is that the preferences of a public majority become the reality in our laws. There's a lot of reasons why this doesn't actually work the way it's conceptualized there. And one of those is that we don't often have a very good idea of who should be included in a democracy. Should it be every single living person? To some degree that doesn't make sense because very young children may not have the ability to form ideas about what they want in policy. Similarly, there are other categories of people who may not be able to participate fully in that. And historically, our democracies have excluded a lot of people. For a very long time, only white landowning men could vote in this country, for example. And then we began to be more inclusive through granting slaves or former slaves the right to vote, by granting women the right to vote. And we also have to wrestle with what is meant by representative. So if we elect representatives who are supposed to enact public policies that the majority of people want, how do they know what people want? What is their mechanism for getting that information? And does representative mean that they physically and represent the people? Should there be elected officials from all segments of society, for example? And so I hope some of these questions illustrate the complexity of what the folk theory of democracy really glosses over and why it's problematic. So the next question is, why democracy? Why is this a system of governance that we should strive to? And for most of this discussion on the benefits of democracy and criteria of democracy, I rely heavily on the ideas of Robert Dahl, presented in his 1998 book on democracy, which provides a really excellent overview of the conceptualization of democracy. So, democracy is expected to provide many benefits to societies. First, democracy helps prevent government by cruel and vicious autocrats. We can look through history to see numerous examples of these where one person who does not have the good of the entire population in mind can really corrupt what government does, and by effect, the quality of life for the people who live under that rule. The second benefit of democracy is that it guarantees its citizens fundamental rights that non-democratic systems do not and cannot grant. This is, and I'll get to more of this later with the discussion of market economy and the benefits that people are expected to be able to produce for themselves. A third benefit of democracy is that it ensures its citizens a broader range of personal freedoms than any feasible alternative to it. So it gives people a lot of autonomy and choice and really their own direction, which in this country is one of our foundational ideals, that people have that freedom. Fourth, democracy helps people protect their own fundamental interests. The idea here is that if people are able to be involved in the process of determining the laws under which they live, that collectively we'll be able to have laws and societal norms that promote the well-being and benefit of the full society, including each individual within it. A fifth benefit is that only a democratic government can provide maximum opportunities for people to exercise the freedom of self-determination and live under the laws of their own choosing. Further, only a democratic government can provide a maximum opportunity for exercising moral responsibility. By participating in our governments, by really thinking through what kinds of policies and laws we want to live under, it forces us, or should force us, to reflect on what this means for humanity as a whole. Democracy also fosters human development more fully than any feasible alternative. As part of wrestling with these ethical and moral questions, there's a lot of personal growth that is expected to be inherent in that process. Number 8, only a democratic government can foster a relatively high degree of political equality. And I'll get into this in the next part about the necessary criteria for large-scale democracy. But one of the necessary things is some degree of political equality. If people are going to be contributing to the laws and policies and making those decisions about how they're governed, there needs to be some degree of political equality so that each voice, each person, has an equal opportunity to have a say over this process and the decisions that are made. Another perceived benefit of democracy is that, and this is really what the evidence shows in empirical research, that modern representative democracies tend to not fight wars with each other. From a moral perspective, this is a really good thing because it lessens the destructiveness that comes along with war. And the final benefit that Robert Dahl really highlights is that countries with democratic governance tend to be more prosperous than countries with non-democratic governance. And again, we know this from empirical research, and that these governments that can be classified as democratic tend to be more economically prosperous, have a higher quality of life for its citizens. And that kind of gets into how this relates to the market economic portion of the talk. So this kind of brings us to, what do we need? What criteria are necessary to realize these theoretical benefits? And this is something that we have to think through if we want to have a democratic system that fully realizes these anticipated benefits. So Dahl presents 6 different criteria that he sees as necessary for large scale, and this is a nation state scale, of democracy. And the first is elected officials. There have to be people who are elected by the public to make policy decisions. The second is free, fair, and frequent elections. This really gets at the opportunity by which the public has an opportunity to replace elected officials who are not meeting the goals of democracy. Third is freedom of expression. And this we really see in the US context through our freedom of speech and the protections listed in the Constitution for freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, and freedom of the press, which ties to the 4th criteria necessary, which is alternative sources of information. And that every member of society needs to be able to access information from multiple sources to draw their own conclusions and make decisions about what kinds of policies they want to see. The 5th criteria is associational autonomy. This is the freedom of association. We as citizens need to be able to network with each other and work with each other in ways that will help advance our view of what needs to be done in the sphere of governance, and to try and make that happen. And the 6th is probably the most important one, and it's an inclusive citizenship. And this is really where we deal with questions of who has a right to participate in the system. And this is one of the biggest areas where democracy can really be undermined. And so an inclusive citizenship, as defined by Dahl, is that every adult in a community, in a society, under this governance structure must be able to participate in the elections, must be able to get the information that they need. And so it can't be limited by things like your socioeconomic class or your gender or sex. It shouldn't be limited by your ethnicity or race. And so that's really what Dahl means by the inclusive citizenship criteria. Winston Churchill is quoted as saying, "It has been said that democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the others that have been tried." And so an alternative to democracy that tries to get at some of the same goals is this idea of guardianship. And in the US context, we do see this in the form of our bureaucracy, because in our system of government, a lot of policy decisions are made by the bureaucracy, where we have public officials who are not in elected positions. And so there's a much less clear link between people choosing their representatives who are making policy decisions. In a pure form of guardianship, it would be that all of the political trust is placed in one person or a group of people who are expected to make decisions through either their superior understanding of the issues or some other criteria that they can be trusted to make good decisions for society and the public good. So historically, societies with democratic forms of governance tend to co-occur with market capitalist economies. Dahl explains this as the two exist in a kind of antagonistic symbiosis. And so that's kind of what I want to talk about now when I turn to market economics. Market capitalist economics is usually defined as a system where private individuals and corporations own the means of production, where private investments drive the economy, and where competitive markets link employers and workers. And this is a quote from a paper by Ravikumar in 2010. And underlying the market capitalist, I'm going to say experiment, is an idea or theory about how humans make decisions. And it's based on the idea that humans are rational decision makers. So the rational human has wants and beliefs that guide our decisions, and means we are capable to some degree of making decisions that make us more likely to achieve our wants. And this rests on a set of assumptions. The first of which is that preferences or wants are self-interested. We primarily want to make decisions and pursue things that will feed our self-interests, either better provide for our basic needs of food, shelter, companionship. It will make decisions that will increase our self-worth or our property value, maximize our labor. Another assumption is that a person's beliefs are the hunches that somebody has about how effectively they can obtain their wants by making different choices. And this merely means that a person has an idea of how to most effectively get what they want. And another important assumption in here is that people can learn from their choices and outcomes in order to change their beliefs and improve the efficiency of their choices. And this is what Kenneth Shepsley describes as instrumental rationality. And so rationality is maximizing behavior. Humans want to maximize what they get for their effort. And so some of the benefits or perceived benefits of market capitalism are that they provide monetary incentives for individuals to be productive members of society. And this is really because market capitalism is expected to maximize the benefit to all parties in a transaction. And so really, we're talking about microeconomics here, not macroeconomics. And so the foundational building block is these individual decisions related to transactions of goods and trying to maximize the utility or contentment that comes out of those transactions for each individual involved. Another benefit is that individuals are expected to have agency to participate by using either their own labor or property in order to produce wealth or other self-interested goods. And then the final big benefit that's expected from a market capitalist economy is that it prevents large bureaucratic governments. And so it reduces that need to have a centralized decision-making force. And the result of these individual transactions is expected to be Pareto optimal outcomes, where the utility of all people involved is maximized by giving them the maximum potential result from that transaction. And the Pareto optimal term comes from, or is based on Vilfredo Pareto, who was a 19th century Italian economist and philosopher. And his ideas influence the understanding of how individual market decision-making influences the utility of all involved parties. So a lot of this is represented in the traditional supply and demand curves, where you have price on one axis and quantity on another, and there is an ideal equilibrium point where these two curves meet, where the supply, or what's being produced by companies or individuals, meets exactly the demand of what people are willing to pay for that product. And there's a supply and demand curve theoretically for any potential thing that we may want to procure through our economic system. But there's an inherent conflict between this market capitalism and democracy. And I think a lot of this comes from the fact that we have negative externalities. When you have a transaction between individuals, that transaction can have impacts that on other people that are unintended. And this can result in negative externalities. And this concept of negative externalities and market failures that come with it is the primary reason why there is it's necessary to have some government involvement or regulation in economies. And one of the big things here is that democracy has never endured in a country that does not have at least a partial market capitalist economy. And this is because economic entities have no obligation to strive for public good, and their self-interested motivations are sufficient, and there's no need for central direction. So you don't have to have your government directing the economy. And instead, the mechanism for this control is the market. And the markets control and coordinate this system for economic growth more efficiently than any known economic structure through the competition of innumerable economic actors. And economic actors are either individuals or corporations in this sense. Economic growth is really good for democracy because it creates a large middling stratum of property owners who tend to seek education, autonomy, personal freedom, property rights, rule of law, and participation in government. And this is really good for democracy. As we discussed before, democracy tends to really hold up personal freedoms, and it's driven by this participation in government. So this middling stratum that tends to occur with a market capitalist economy is a really good thing for democracy there. And the decentralization of a market economy removes the need for a powerful or authoritarian central government, which would really detract from this idea of government, or this idea of democracy, where the citizenship of a country are participating in the policy decisions that are made. If we were to need a central government that had to direct a lot of that, the logistical challenges would just be far too many for trying to involve people in that process of direction. Now, democracy and capitalism also have a lot of conflicts in ways that they detract from one another. Democracy and capitalism each modify and limit the other, making a balance between the two really difficult to achieve. For example, market capitalism inherently creates inequalities which compromise political equity. And as we discussed before, political equity is really necessary for democracy to thrive and function. Market capitalism is also unfavorable to the development of democracy beyond what Dahl would call a polyarchal democracy, which is what he sees as the largest form of democracy that we have conceptualized yet, and that would be at the nation-state level, where you have just a really high degree of complexity. And we haven't thought through how to foster a democracy that can go beyond that with market capitalist economies. And now I have another quote from Winston Churchill, who is quoted as saying, the next quote I have is John Maynard Keynes, who said, "Capitalism is the astounding belief that the most wickedest of men will do the most wickedest of things for the greatest good of everyone." And that's kind of referring to that Pareto optimal idea where these transactions that are very much based in self-interest motivation are supposed to create the most optimal good for everyone involved. And so this raises the question of where do we go from here? One of the directions that we need to go is we need to look at deepening democracy. So trying to understand where in our system policy decisions are being made and wrestle with how the public has or doesn't have any degree of control over those policy decisions. As I mentioned before, within the bureaucracy, we have a lot of public officials who are making policy decisions about that really influence the quality of life and the options and opportunities that are available to the citizens in this country. So we may need to think about how do we make those processes more democratic if they're not being driven by a system of elections. We need to consider civic education and how people in this country are understanding democracy as a governance structure, how they're understanding representation, and how they're understanding the connection of those to the economy. And where does that education take place? Is it in something that's government provided? Is it through forums like this where we get to learn about new things and then discuss them? Does it happen in the family? Where does that responsibility lie? And then, in my view, we also need to begin to conceptualize democracy beyond nation state or beyond this polyarchal democracy presented by Dahl. And one of the reasons that I believe that this is a necessary step is because market capitalism is evolving into something, or some may argue has evolved into something that really transcends national boundaries through trade agreements, through worker mobility, and global consumerism. However, the laws that govern such economic activity are still constrained, especially on an enforcement front, by national boundaries. And so our laws can really only apply to what happens under the jurisdiction of the nation state or the governance entity that creates those laws. And there's a big challenge to the legitimacy of international organizations, as we've seen recently with some of the actions of our current president to withdraw us from multinational agreements that have been reached. And then one of the other big challenges here is the impact of negative externalities from a global perspective. So decisions made here in the United States surrounding trade agreements and where different commodities are produced can create these negative externalities that have a real impact beyond our own borders. So things like global wealth inequality, when the means of production are moved to another country, even though the consumption is still here, workers and labor, the value of labor in other countries, can be suppressed, and that has big impacts on our own economy as well. And so this brings us to an ethical arena that really transcends the limited constraint of how market capitalism understands human beliefs as related to rational choice that is self-interested. If we're going to care about those negative externalities that are beyond our own borders, or even within our own borders, we have to be able to think about things like quality of life and what that means, and whether there needs to be some floor of what's an acceptable quality of life for everyone, so that we don't end up with a large section of the population that logistically cannot participate in either economy or in our democratic governance. And so on that note, I'm going to turn back to Dahl's criteria of democracy and kind of explore those in a more US context. So these are the criteria that I discussed before. And elected officials, this brings up a lot of questions in our current context, because we do have a very real phenomena where people really only seek elected office if they have higher education, if they have greater economic means, whether that's of their own or connections to, because it costs a lot of money to run a campaign and get elected. You also have to know where to go and what forms to file and how to even work through that process of becoming an elected official. And then we also need to consider that these elected officials, once they're in office, how do they understand the public will, and how much obligation do they have to actually enact that in the policies that they support? The second here is free, fair, and frequent elections. In the US, I think this is really coming to a boiling point, as we're seeing with some state primaries right now. Under the realities of COVID-19, we have some areas where an entire city only has one polling place. And that really raises questions about how fair elections are. Another aspect of the United States context that ties into this idea of free elections is when you have a workforce that is involved in kind of 9-to-5 regularly scheduled jobs, there are some questions about barriers to entry that they face in trying to participate in elections. Do they have to take time off of work and thus lose potential economic gain in order to participate? How difficult is it to access information about the elections and the candidates that they're going to vote for? Third, freedom of expression, and this is a really important one in light of all of the recent protests. We've had protests that are opposing different policy restrictions placed by COVID. There was a plethora of protests opposing having to wear masks out in public. And this is a one way that the public can make their will known about different policies. There have been huge protests over the last several weeks regarding the racial inequities in our criminal justice system. It's another way of the public trying to demand policy change and really influence their elected officials to do or to enact policies that they prefer. For alternative sources of information, in the US context, this one is an interesting one to consider. Because while we do have a body of press organizations, there is a lot of interties into the economic world. And a lot of those news outlets have really been made into for-profit organizations, which raises questions about the influence of money on the information that's actually getting shared among the public and what the public has the availability to consume. Fifth, associational autonomy. This is a critical one that is in jeopardy right now in our country with the potential threats to our ability to organize, our ability to protest, our ability to form organizations for the purpose of expressing policy preferences. And then inclusive citizenship. This is one that the United States has never done particularly well. We've already talked a little bit about the different points in our history where different groups of people gained the right to vote. And so in our history, we have not always had an inclusive view of citizenship and who gets to participate in elections. But there's still hurdles here to overcome. For example, many states still have policies where individuals convicted of a felony lose their right to vote. And this is really problematic from a democratic standpoint, because if there are mechanisms by which citizens can lose their right to vote, it creates a perverse incentive for elected officials to try and remove people who might oppose them through these mechanisms. And this may be one explanation for why there is such great racial disparity in terms of who is actually being arrested and detained and charged and convicted of different crimes. And the result of that is that we have a huge disparity in the demographic representation of people who have lost their right to vote in this country. It is overwhelmingly Black Americans and people of color who have lost their right to vote through those felony disenfranchisement laws. And so these are things that we really need to wrestle with if we're going to try and push forward a balance of democracy and market economy to create a system that really provides the most personal freedoms for every individual in this country and beyond if we start to consider global democracy. And so with that, that is my talk, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion and any questions that you all may have. And I've included my email address if anybody's interested after the talk. I'm happy to send a list of readings and resources that are particularly enlightening for this topic.
All right. Thanks for your talk. I'm waiting for people to start using the raise hand feature in Zoom so I can call on you and you can ask your questions.
Okay. Jill, thank you for this talk. You touched so many really deep issues. And my question is that I see at least some anecdotal evidence that democracy works really well for small countries with high level of mutual trust and social cohesion, like Scandinavian countries, for instance. And the larger countries are struggling with this. Mm-hmm. And do you have some systematic evidence that either supports these observations or maybe does not, but says something about this? And another related question is, do you have any ideas about how we can develop this level of trust that seems necessary for democracy on a national and even international scale? Because otherwise I don't see how this global democracy can sustain.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you. That's a great question. To address your first question about whether or not there is evidence that democracy works better on smaller scale, more homogeneous country level versus, a country like the United States that has a really quite large population with a lot of ethnic and economic diversity. And yes, there have definitely been a lot of economics or a lot of empirical studies that do support this, which really raises those questions about size and scalability of democracy. And I think in order to, like I said, deepen democracy, we're going to have to wrestle with trying to ask and answer some causal questions about what causes those difficulties. And I don't have the answers. If I did, I think we'd all be in a better place right now. But that's part of what I hope to address through my career in studying these kinds of questions. And I think to address your second question and about what might need to be in place to achieve a more global democracy is really trying to answer some of those questions about what does it mean to be human and what are inherent human rights that we believe all people should have. And once we can answer that, once we kind of figure out where that floor is, then we can start to think about how to make our systems and structures of governance more inclusive, and really try and reduce the barriers to entry that exist. And I think a big part of this is going to be from education. And it's not that any one person or one institution is going to come up with all the answers and try and teach it to everybody else. In my view, I think a lot of that education is going to come from conversations that we have with each other about these hard questions and hard topics. Does that kind of answer your question?
Yes, to the degree that is possible, probably yes.
Okay, I'm going to Dana St. George. Okay. Well, I'm having trouble unmuting you here. Could you mute yourselves? We're not hearing you. I can't unmute you. You got to unmute yourself.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay. So, yeah, I have a couple of items. One, ask you to talk about two things. One is the influence of legalized bribery, where Congress basically does what lobbyists want rather than what the people want. And the other one is the effect of our election system, where we have this winner-take-all system. We don't have ranked choice voting. We don't have proportional representation. We don't have a parliamentary system. So those are the two questions.
Okay. So to address the first one about the legalized bribery that is in our current American system, yes, this is a huge problem. And the way I see it and the way that I've seen it in a lot of academic literature is that we have a link that maybe should not exist between our economic system and our political system, whereby economic power translates to political power.
Right.
And this has been in existence far longer than some things like the Citizens United decision that a lot of people point to as causing this problem, but it's really existed a lot longer than that. Schattschneider in 1960 highlighted that the heavenly chorus, or the public voice, is largely dominated by wealthy individuals. And this was followed up. There's a great book called Inequality. Let me see if I can find it really quick. Unequal and Unrepresented. And this is a book by three great authors, Kay Lehman-Schlossman, Henry Brady, and Sidney Verba. And it talks about political inequality and the people's voice, particularly in the electoral system. And what they found is that wealthier individuals, more highly educated individuals, and people who have had more opportunity to develop civic skills tend to be the ones that have more influence and voice in our political system. And I think, this is just confirming what a lot of us already know. But their book, I think it came out in 2016 or maybe 2018, and it really does dive into that empirical evidence that this disparity exists in our political system that equates economic power to political power. And I think that's a problem for trying to find this balance between market capitalist economy and democracy or democratic governance. Can you repeat your second question for me?
Yeah, it was about our election process where we have this winner take all now. We don't have ranked choice voting. We don't have, and we don't have proportional representation. We don't have a parliamentary system.
Mm-hmm. And I think this is probably in part a byproduct of the problems that are inherent with scaling up democracy, but also does tie to that link between economic power and political power. And there's a couple things that I know of that are in the works to try and address this. One of them is a push to try and undercut the Electoral College at the national level and make it so that whoever wins the popular vote also wins the presidency. And this is an initiative called National Popular Vote. It's been adopted by several states already. And once they hit a threshold of enough states to meet more than 50% of Electoral College votes, it will become the default system. And this has been passed through state legislatures because Congress has not taken this on as an issue. And the idea is that these state legislatures can pass this law that says as soon as that threshold is met, their state's electoral votes will automatically go to whoever wins the popular vote nationally. And so kind of get around the barriers, the state level barriers to having the control of the presidency be really through the Electoral College rather than through the public and the population of voters. So that's one example of an initiative right now that's on the table to try and address some of those issues. But I'm sure you all know of others, and I would love to hear about them when we get to the more open-ended conversation part of this.
Well, yeah. Okay, she's next then. Another thing is the current system. There's nothing in the Constitution that says anything about political parties, but we've got into this system where we essentially have two parties that dominate things. There are hundreds of parties out there, but they have limited ability, very limited, and when you have this winner take all, you have a situation where people do this lesser of two evils voting, and they can't even choose the one they really want. And this really confuses things. It's like in the 2000 election, about half the people who voted for Gore didn't like Gore, but they disliked Bush more, and vice versa the other way around as well. So I think that's a major problem.
I would agree with you. And in the laws surrounding political parties and the policies internal to those political parties themselves, there is no obligation to uphold the democratic ideals of political equality for all people. And so I agree with you. The political party system in our country is a problem, and the way that our system of governance is designed right now really doesn't allow for more than two parties, which also contributes to that problem.
Right. It's your turn.
I just wanted to make a comment about the size of countries that are having more success with democratic systems. And I wondered if another factor in that was that there were more homogeneous cultures, whereas our culture is extremely diverse now. And there's a lot of identity politics going on, and everyone has different goals. And it seems that it's harder to achieve consensus about what the underlying values and what people want. And it's just, our country is so large, and there are so many different groups all clamoring at the top of their lungs for their particular issue that I'm wondering if it's actually manageable at all at the size that it is, and whether it would be better off broken into regions.
That's a great question. Robert Dahl does address that in his book on democracy, and it was actually published a second edition with edits by Ian Shapiro in 2015, where he added more onto this discussion as well. But one of the, at least Dahl describes this as one of the reasons that homogenous societies tend to find it easier to implement democratic ideals is that there's less identity competition between diverse groups. So there is more consensus of what needs to happen. And while this does pose big challenges for countries like the United States that are much more diverse, I don't think, at this point in my career anyways, that that's an insurmountable challenge. And this may be, a bit idealistic on my part, but I think we have to work towards understanding those challenges and those barriers to that prevent a more diverse country from realizing the ideals of democracy, because really we do, and this is my view, we do have a moral imperative to work towards a more just society for all. And that includes the quality of life that everyone has, the freedoms, the autonomy, and agency that each individual has, regardless of their background and regardless of which identity groups they may belong to. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges facing us at this moment in time.
We got to move on to the next. We got a lot of people in line, so next question, which is from Emma, and trying to okay, you're unmuted, Emma. Go ahead.
I have about 3 questions.
Okay.
The first one is that you mentioned negative polarity. Can you give us more examples about negative polarity?
Yeah.
Should I say one question at a time or all questions?
Yeah, how about I answer one at a time just so I don't forget what the questions are? So negative externalities, this is an economic term, and it refers to kind of unintended negative byproducts of those economic transactions that make up the bedrock of a market capitalist economy. And so one great example of a negative externality is when corporations produce, for example, oil. And this leads to a lot of negative environmental externalities whereby we may have polluted air, polluted water, that then adversely affects people who are not part of the transaction directly. So, for example, and this is where we get a lot of the racial and economic disparities, but what we tend to see in this country is that the pollution impacts tend to adversely affect people who are poorer communities, and communities of other marginalized people, because the production facilities that produce this pollution tend to be located in those communities, because those people have less political agency to say, no, we don't want those here, or to put more strict regulations on that production that would enforce lower pollution levels. So that's one example of a negative externality, but it doesn't have to be just environmental impacts that are negative, that impact broader segments of society. You can also have this in economic negative externalities. And so some of the trade agreements that the US has had historically that have moved jobs overseas, it moves a lot of that pollution elsewhere to impact other people, even though we're primarily consuming those goods here. And then it also allows those producers to hire people and obtain labor at far lower rates, which is not realizing a Pareto optimal outcome by kind of artificially lowering the value of labor.
So how does it affect democracy?
Sorry, what was that?
The examples you gave, how do they affect democracy? It seems like just an economic thing.
So those impact democracy in a number of different ways, and often it's indirect. and not necessarily obvious, which is probably why we don't always think about economic realities and democratic governance as being related. So, for example, if you have a community that's affected by negative environmental externalities, let's take, for example, Flint, Michigan, which had their water supply compromised because of a deal made for corporate benefit. And their water supply for the community was transitioned from something that was clean and healthy to something that was severely contaminated and resulted in many children in the community getting lead poisoning. Down the road, one of the impacts that this may have is we know that lead poisoning can reduce individual IQ levels and reduce people's ability to learn. So this would relate to democracy because suddenly you have an entire generation of children that may not reach their full educational potential and may not be able to fully form their policy conceptions of what kinds of policy outcomes they want. They may be less likely to or less able to participate in the political system once they reach adulthood because of that lead poisoning that came from a negative externality. So that's one example. There's a bunch of them out there, but hopefully that makes a little more sense to how those are connected.
Okay, so my next question has to do with democracy in a country and the democracy in organizations. Mm-hmm. Is there correlations between, or the difference and the contrast between these two kind of democracy?
For the purposes of this talk, I'm really considering democracy as a form of governance, and so not as much democracy within organizations, which organizations typically belong more in the economic realm. And this is one area where I think in the US there's a lot of muddled ground between the two, because we have a really huge nonprofit sector that aims to provide public goods and is not necessarily trying to maximize economic profits. And so in a way, those nonprofits are taking on the role of what would normally fall under a democratic governance structure to provide social safety nets to help maintain the ability of all to participate in the system. And so when we're talking about democracy within an organization, I think it's a different conversation that needs to happen because your goals aren't necessarily the same as what you would expect in a democratic governance structure for a country.
Okay. All right. So does democracy is only about voting, or is about the check and balance? So for the U.S., it's about the Congress and the Supreme Court.
So this idea that democracy is only about voting is really kind of under that folk theory of democracy. And one of the dangers of assuming that democracy only relates to elections is that it really short circuits a lot of those other criteria of democracy, particularly political equality of citizenship and an inclusive citizenship. And I think in the US context, the structure of our government has tried to get at some of those other criteria of democracy by putting into our Constitution requirements for checks and balances between the three branches of government, by also providing for freedom of assembly, freedom of the press. But a lot of that gets it doesn't get as much attention as it maybe should when we're thinking about democracy, when people start thinking of democracy very narrowly as only being under the realm of electoral politics.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Okay, we got to move on to Dick Hewitson. You were unmuted. Are you still awake?
Thank you. I've been thinking a lot for a long time about the fact that our economy in this country, from the beginning, was built on slavery.
Mhm.
And the more I think about that, I don't think that's changed. And I'd like to get your comments on my thoughts. My thought is that we still have a form of slavery.
Mhm.
And the form of slavery we have is that we have many people in this country who are stuck on jobs that they have no future. They're never going to get any more money. And we refer to them sometimes as like minimum wage workers or whatever.
Mhm.
And I live in a retirement community, and those people take care of me. And I feel very bad about it. And I know that they have no hope of ever getting a raise. They have no future. And I hear many of my counterparts, middle-class people, bragging about the cheap help they can get. And I just think this is such a shame. And when I hear people talk about, politicians talk about minimum wage, I would love to have them talk about a living wage rather than a minimum wage. And living wage means that if you have a job and you work 40 hours a week, you can live decently.
Mhm.
I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
I would completely agree with that. I think then this is kind of where I talked about the fact that the United States system of governance and the form of democracy that we have often ignores the historical realities that have created the structure we have. One big example of this that's been really salient in the past few weeks is the idea of a police force. Police forces were initially created to protect the property, and by property, this means slaves, of slave owners, of plantation owners. And I think at some level, the underlying goal of policing has not changed from those days. It is still to primarily to protect the property of the wealthy. The more property you have, the more reason the police have to help you. And so this has resulted in a lot of disparities along the socioeconomic scale and along racial lines. And I think as a country, we have not adequately addressed the origins of the structure that we have and the realities of what that structure does in our society. I think it's very similar for this idea of a minimum wage. And we've had a minimum wage that for many, many years has been inadequate to provide a good quality of life for a lot of people. And when somebody is struggling to make ends meet, when they are not able to earn enough with their labor to accumulate any other kinds of property, then they're really at a huge disadvantage for participating in our economy. And this is an inequality that is inherent in market capitalism. And in my view, democracy as a system of governance, in an ideal form, has the means to constrain the inequality, to get from, or to prevent it from becoming so extreme that it adversely impacts the ability of a large segment of the population to live an adequate life. And when somebody is forced into this position where they can't make ends meet, they're having to work 2 or 3 different jobs, they don't know how they're going to put food on their table, they don't know how they're going to pay for healthcare if they have a health emergency, this really distracts from people being able to participate or think about the policies that they want their government to have. And so this economic inequality really produces a democratic society that is undemocratic, if you think about it, because you have a segment of the population that's ever increasing that does not have the means or time or ability to participate fully in the governance. And so they often then get disenfranchised, and this becomes a self-perpetuating cycle.
Thank you.
Okay, Carl A. You're unmuted now.
So I'm unmuted now?
Yep.
Yeah, I just had a quick question. I don't know if it has a long answer, but I was wondering if you know of any different kinds of ways in which countries have been able to tamper down the influence of money in politics. Apparently, our legal system has somehow or another gotten sufficiently distorted that money is equal to freedom of speech. So anyway, I'll stop talking.
I don't know of any countries that have done this exceptionally well. There are examples in other countries that, in some ways, represent a perhaps better way of dealing with some of this. In India, for example, and there's a lot of debate about how good the outcomes actually are, but in their democracy, they have a remarkably diverse population in terms of religious beliefs, ethnic backgrounds. And what it has created is, by necessity, in order to take power of their national government, political actors have to form coalitions, or at least traditionally. I think right now it is governed by a majority of one bloc. But historically, they've had to create these coalitions of competing groups in order for one group to take power. And so in that context, power has shifted around quite a bit more, I think, than in the United States necessarily. In another example might be in Canada, where they have 3 primary political parties that have kind of shifted in power balance over the years. And they have a more proportional representation system. And then those elected officials then have to collaborate or compromise in some ways to elect a prime minister. Does that answer your question?
He muted himself. I don't know if he can unmute himself. I click the unmute, Carl.
Block me from unmuting. Okay. Yeah, I think mostly you did. I do know that in some countries, they actually do limit the amount of expenditures by persons.
Yeah.
And we seem to be distorted in that particular fashion, but apparently the closest countries, I guess, are the Scandinavian countries, where it's not quite so bad. I have no idea how bad is it there. But anyway, I'll stop asking questions. Give someone else a chance.
One other thing I'll add to that is here in the United States context, if you look at the state level governments, different states have vastly different ways of handling money in politics at the state level. And some states have far lower limits. They have greater reporting requirements, which increases transparency so that the public can actually see who is spending what on which political candidates. And so in some ways, that level of transparency or limiting campaign contributions can have an effect on the representation of elected officials once they're in office. But I don't know that there's any state that does it perfectly, and I'm probably more familiar with the state level governments than I am with the financial contribution limits of other countries.
Okay, we're going to move on to Alex and Senna. I clicked unmute, but you're not unmute.
Okay.
Oh, there we go.
I'm here. Yeah, I was thinking the Constitution, I believe, guarantees that all the states will have a democratic form of government. And my impression is that's not very well defined. I wonder if we could maybe pass a law requiring things like universal voting and something to control the polls so that every neighborhood has access to voting polls, and also even that convicted criminals should be able to vote. After all, they understand what leads to crime, and if they want to vote, there must be some reason for that.
Mm-hmm.
Question is, can anything be done to encourage more democracy at the state level?
I think there's a lot of things that can be done to encourage more democracy at the state level. But probably no easy fixes.
Yeah, I don't see any easy solution to any of the problems that you brought up.
Yeah. One thing that I will point out, I don't think that the word democracy is actually in our U.S. Constitution at all.
I'm wrong.
However, it is referenced, at least in part, kind of like the James Madison quote that I read earlier. This idea of democracy and democratic governance is debated quite fiercely in things like the Federalist Papers. Not a whole lot of people ever read those, though. So I think part of what needs to happen is we need to expand the discussion beyond just the Constitution and perhaps recognize that the Constitution is a starting point. And the Founding Fathers really saw it as an experiment and something that would evolve over time and was meant to evolve over time. And I don't know that that idea has really been carried forward as much as it could be to encourage democratic governance in state and local governments.
Okay. I was, as long as I've got the microphone, I was also wondering if we were discussing the size of a country and how that influences its ability to be democratic. Has a study been done of the small countries, Andorra, San Marino,
Mm-hmm.
Monaco, how their democracies work, assuming they are democracies or democratic?
That I'm not nearly as familiar with. So I would want to look into that more before I gave a concrete answer. But there are definitely these two, at least two axes that create difficulties with democratic governance as you expand, and that's as population increases, it becomes harder to incorporate everybody's views in a way that is reflecting political equity. And then as distance expands, it becomes harder for people to participate as well. So this is one of the things that I really saw very clearly living in Alaska for nearly a decade, because up there, the majority of communities are off the road system. So you can't drive to bigger communities for shopping or anything. You have to fly or dog sled or take a snow machine or boat. And this creates a lot of barriers. And one of the things I saw with the 2016 presidential primary up there is that because it is party run, it ended up not being particularly democratic because there was not a primary held in every community. Again, this relates to those logistic challenges of trying to get materials out and really host something in all of these communities that aren't connected. So if you have two villages that are only 25 miles away, if they're not connected by road, it can be very difficult for somebody in this community to get to this community to vote or participate in that process. And I think that really provides an example of how some of those geographic realities get more and more complicated the more distance that you have or the more geographic area you have in a country.
Thank you.
Thanks, Alex. And I believe Monaco is a monarchy. I don't know about the other ones, though. Eric T., you're unmuted.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you.
Oh, great. Well, thank you for the talk. And I do have some questions. This first time here. Do you mean what do you mean by democracy? It seems like by including equity as part of that, or redefining it, it sounds more like socialism.
So I think
Or what is the difference?
well, socialism is another economic model, in a sense, where production is primarily governed by the state or the government. And so it steps outside of the idea of a democratic governance and kind of it bleeds more into the economic realm. So by democracy, if I had to give a super concise definition of what I mean by this term, it is a form of governance that allows the people who live under the laws of that governance system to participate or have some degree of influence over the laws under which they live. Does that make sense?
Yes, great. So there's a distinction there between the economic model versus
Yes.
The political aspect of it.
Exactly. And so by democracy, I'm really trying to focus on the system of governance. And the economic piece of that is separate.
Okay, but to provide the equity, though, for people, citizens, there is some government intervention required, would you say?
Yeah, and that's why there has to be a discussion about what the appropriate balance is between the economy and the system of governance. With socialism, you have the system of governance really directing the economy. With market capitalism, which is the form of economic system that we see most often, at least in part, with democracies, is really founded in this principle that it does not have a central government structure directing it, and that it is directed by these markets that emerge naturally out of these innumerable individual transactions that occur. I think probably the closest thing that gets at what you might be thinking of would be democratic socialism, which is one particular view of how balance might be achieved by a free market economy and a democratic governance structure.
Okay, so one more question. So I'm from South America. I'm an immigrant, and my whole life, just from living there, being exposed to political parties and governments there in my home country, is that the smaller the government, the better the democracy. The better democracy is. So the opposite is that bigger the government, the more power, the more corruption. And in the chat, I give an example of Cuba and Venezuela.
Mm-hmm. I think in some situations, in some contexts, that may be true, but I don't necessarily think that that's a causal relationship between size of government and levels of corruption. Because we look at some of the Scandinavian countries or European countries, or even to some degree India, although there is a lot of inequality there as well. But we do see examples of countries which have democratic governance where there's some agreed on conception of what a minimal quality of life is for people and what a minimum level of equitability there is for participation in political spheres or political endeavors, and for participation and really that freedom in the economic sphere as well. Because I think when you're talking about personal freedoms on the economic side, you have to have enough resources to really be able to participate. Otherwise, you're not really free in the economic system. So if labor is the only thing that you have in an economic system, if it's devalued to the point that you can't sell your labor to make enough to live on, to find contentment, then you're really not particularly free in that economic system. And so I think when we talk about this complex relationship between democracy and market economy, it's really about trying to find where is that balance. And I don't necessarily think that balance relies on size of government. I think Oh, go ahead.
Doesn't it balance it out? Balance this out? Because sure, in capitalism, yes, or actually in any hierarchical society, there are fewer people on top and more people on the bottom. So there's many more of us who are don't earn as much, but we have more voice in numbers. Whereas, let's say the top 1%, sure, there's very few of them, but they do have the capital or the wealth to create some impact.
I think one of the things here is this idea of how economic power translates to political power. And that's, I think, one of the keys to balancing these two ideas. And so I think in order to address some of these problems that we see in democratic societies, we really have to address that mechanism by which economic power translates to political power. Because
but I think, sorry to interrupt, I think we do have the power. I mean, with the people, we're so many of them. Like if you just count, if you don't count the 1%, there's so many of us. I think it's more of a matter of education and cultural more than anything else.
Because it doesn't matter if you have a lot of people, if they don't participate, if they don't have a way of making their voices heard to direct policy, then it doesn't really matter how many of them there are.
Yeah, because I think that, the apathy, I think it's been a big problem for the U.S.
It's definitely a big problem here.
Yeah.
I have to move on to the next question. Thanks,
Thank
Eric.
you.
And that is Fran Naylor and probably Jim. You're unmuted.
I'm unmuted? All right.
Yep.
Please comment on this statement. Democracy is an inherently unstable form of government as power inevitably evolves to the top, and the historical record would appear to bear that out.
I would agree with that statement, actually. I think even in the best democracy example that we have on the planet, there is still some degree of consolidation of power. And unfortunately, there's not a ton of academic research on this concept of power. It's kind of this nebulous idea, but people have a really hard time nailing down exactly what that is and how we measure it. But one of the things that we do know is that people in power tend to not want to relinquish that power. And same thing with entities, whether that's corporate entities, whether that's nonprofit entities. Once you have that power to make decisions, it's hard to kind of let that go. And I think we see this on a societal scale as well with all of these recent discussions about racial inequality. And this is one of the, I'm kind of going to bleed into a completely different topic here that is also huge. But this idea of white supremacy and or white privilege. And when you have those privileges, it can be hard to see beyond the bounds of that. So, for example, to bring this back to the political discussion, our members of Congress, they are in huge positions of power. And they often are not very well connected to other segments of the population that do not have those privileges that come with the power that they have. And so they may be intentionally or unintentionally blind to a lot of the very real impacts of power imbalances. And so they don't really have an incentive, whether it's self-interest incentive or public good incentive, to try and correct or adjust those power balance levels. Does that kind of get at your question?
Yes, but again, the economic factors come into play here. More power, more money, more power, more ability to purchase congressmen.
Yep. I think you're spot on there. And that's one of the core questions that I think we as a society need to address, is what prevents that consolidation of power through both the economic and the political realm.
Okay. Looks like we have one more question from Ray. Ray, you're unmuted. Go ahead.
Hey, I have a number of questions, but I'll just ask one of them. You talked about people in power wanting to stay in power, and I'd like you to comment on term limits, both for elected and appointed positions, and the pros and cons of those.
Okay, so term limits is a sticky issue, and there is empirical research that both supports the idea and refutes the idea as an effective mechanism to correct power balance. So I think it was Kansas that implemented term limits for all of their state level, state house and state senate elected officials. And one of the problems with this is that it can, and eventually does, lead to a body of politicians that does not necessarily have institutional knowledge. And it can also lead to a more highly partisan environment. And so in some ways, there's real dangers to term limits because you may inadvertently eliminate politicians who are in it for the public good and who are maybe more committed to some of those public good ideals. But on the flip side, it would also help get rid of some of the people who are elected by the economically powerful. The counter argument that I would give to that argument that it removes people who are more influenced by economic actors is that it really doesn't fix the core problem, because there will always be a surplus of people that economically powerful individuals or corporations can influence. And so you remove one person through a term limit and you'll end up getting somebody else who is also controlled by that economic power, unless there's something that addresses the kind of the core problem of that there is an ability for economic power to influence political power. So term limits I don't necessarily see as being an answer or an end-all be-all solution to this problem.
Okay, and then a couple quick comments. You talked about the need for democracy beyond a nation state because today's capitalism is global, and I'd just like to say that I think that's a really important consideration. You have a nation or nation state trying to regulate capitalism so it doesn't run away, and capitalism is not within the nation state, it's a global entity in the case of big corporations. Mm-hmm. So I think that's an important point. And then you talked about the nonprofit role in a democratic society. It seems like it's kind of in between the government and capitalism. And I think what I see is a lot of nonprofits out there that call themselves nonprofits, but they're really not. They're in it to influence government for the benefit of large corporations or wealthy individuals.
Yeah, and I'd actually like to comment on that last point in response. And I think this ties to, there's a great book that Ms Yordy, I think is his name, published that really focuses on some of the ways that the foundation, the private foundations and the nonprofit sector really, how they contribute to some of the inequalities that we see. Because when you have nonprofits that are primarily funded by private foundations or private economic interests, there's really this incentive to do the bidding of that private foundation or the donor, rather than what may necessarily be in the public interest or the public good. And this is where I think we have kind of a sticky middle ground with the nonprofit sector that doesn't necessarily address this conflict between market economy and democracy, and doesn't necessarily reduce those tensions. And in some ways it can enhance those tensions because it's kind of taking on the role of what we might consider to be a government role to provide for the public good, but making it conform to the wishes and the desires of the people who have that economic capital to donate. I also want to say Happy Father's Day because Ray is my dad.
Thanks.
Okay. We still got more questions, and we may never get to the open discussion at this rate, but there are a lot of good questions coming through, so I'm happy with that. So, Paul, you're unmuted. Go ahead.
This may be a request to you, Matt, or to Jill.
Oh.
I'd like you to show that slide with the contact information for reaching Jill.
Oh, yeah, sure. I can do that. There we go. All right, so my email address is just my name, jill.yordy@ucdenver.edu.
Thank you.
Way down there at the bottom.
Yep, sorry, it's kind of small font for those of you on smaller screens. Hopefully this event will be published later online, the recording, so that you can pause on this screen and zoom in or do whatever you need to.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Okay.
Anybody else need this, or can I stop sharing screen? It's nice to kind of be able to see everybody's faces as we're talking.
Yeah, you can also paste it into the chat. I think somebody did it earlier,
Oh,
but
you know what? That would be
paste it again. Yeah.
We'll do that.
So it looks like Dana, or is that probably Jerry with the question? Oh, didn't unmute. Oh, no, I screwed it up. Try again. There we go.
Wait now. Can you hear me now?
Yep, I can hear you.
Okay, so yeah, at some point you said something about capitalism. I may not say this correctly, but capitalism requires growth. But we're on a finite planet. It seems as though this idea of growth just doesn't work anymore. So there are people who argue, well, capitalism doesn't work anymore in where we are now.
I think that is true if you limit your definition of capitalism to material goods. I think, and I'm not necessarily a huge proponent of capitalism because I do see a lot of the pitfalls that occur or that happen with it. But I am still curious about it because of this relationship that seems to exist between democratic governance and market capitalism. And so I think maybe if we broaden our conceptualization of capitalism to also include non-tangible or non-material goods. So if you think about things like art, song, poetry, those kinds of things are productions that potentially have economic value. And maybe the more that we can move to incorporating those non-tangibles into our conception of capitalism, perhaps there's still quite a bit more room for economic growth in that arena. And that may be something that could be incorporated into a conception of a global democracy as well.
Oh, that's a good idea.
Well, I think that's a good point, and I haven't thought about that. Well, I have thought about it a little bit, but not very much. I need to think about it some more. But it seems like most people think of it, they're more concerned about the material side.
Mm-hmm.
So it seems like a serious potential problem. And I happen to be, my number one concern is global warming. And this has been a known problem for at least 30 years, depending how you look at it. And we still haven't done what we should have done 30 years ago. So.
And I completely agree with you that climate change is a huge problem that really has profound impacts on these ideas of democracy and the market capitalist economy that we really do need to wrestle with, because global warming, as we continue to see extreme weather events, as we continue to see desertification of certain areas where we're losing moisture, losing rainfall, losing biological production in those areas, the human impacts of those are going to fall hardest. And we've already seen the evidence of this, that it's going to fall hardest on marginalized communities, people who are more on the socioeconomic scale. And this isn't just in our country, it's also globally. And the very sad reality that we need to face before it fully gets here is that when the worst of climate change happens, under our current system, it will be only the wealthy that have the means to possibly survive, and maybe not even that. And so I think global warming is definitely one of those issues that needs to tie into a government response and an economic response.
I thought you said something about when it arrives here. In my perspective, it has already arrived here. I mean, here in California, the wildfires that we've had recently, especially the campfires, pretty severe. And Australia's droughts, and there are droughts all over the world. It's here now.
It definitely is. We've got the floods in the Midwest, the floods in the Southeast that have happened more recently, the increases in severity of hurricane impacts that we've seen over the last few years. I agree in full. It just hasn't necessarily hit globally all at once, I guess is what I meant by hasn't yet arrived.
Yeah, I guess it's going to be worse near the equator. Okay, thanks. I'm done.
Okay, thank you.
We'll move on to Michael Abramson. Michael, trying to unmute you. You might. There we go.
Okay. It's about this idea of growth, and in general, someone mentioned about our shared values in a large society that it's difficult to find. Maybe it's a very simplified vision of this, but I see that most of us still have shared values in our country, such as freedom, security, fairness. We all share these values. But the liberal folks, they also, in addition to this, they appreciate the idea of growth, economic growth in particular, and diversity. And maybe we have to be honest and to recognize that growth and diversity can be good and can be bad, or they can be helpful to some people and can hurt other people. And to me it seems that this may be too fast growth and too fast increase in diversity related to globalization, urbanization, immigration, all these issues. Maybe this is what makes it so difficult for us to build this national unity and trust which we need for functional democracy. So I am wondering, what do you think about this?
I agree in full with that. And we do have a lot of really complex problems facing society. And I think there's a lot of academic research out there that touches on different aspects of that. You mentioned trust as being a really important criteria to build to pursue some of these goals of freedom and individual agency, those sorts of things. And there's one researcher who comes to my mind initially that's done a lot of research on this concept of trust in terms of decision making. And that's Elinor Ostrom. And she primarily focused on smaller groups. So this is trying to make decisions surrounding resource management or at the kind of local government level. And that's one of the big questions that's not very well answered right now by the academic community, and I think also not by the practitioner community either, is how do you foster the necessary trust in a society And this is trust of each other, kind of broadly at an individual level. This is trust of the people in their government to make decisions that are for the well-being of the people in a country. And we don't have many good answers about what fosters this trust, what allows for it to grow and thrive. And I think it is one of the challenges that we face in trying to to try and deepen our understanding of democracy. So thank you for bringing that comment up.
And can you repeat or maybe send in chat who it was, Eleanor?
Eleanor Ostrom, and she was a professor at, I believe, Indiana, a university in Indiana. She passed away a few years ago, but she has an incredible body of literature that deals with trust.
And how do you spell her name?
I will put her name in the chat.
Okay, thank you.
So I just shared her name in the chat, and I highly recommend reading some of her work. I think there's one book in particular that I have on my bookshelf called Trust and Reciprocity. That's really fantastic.
Okay, thank you. I'm really interested in this topic, so thank you.
Okay, moving on to Emma. Maybe. I don't know why my unmute is not working very well. Emma, you may need to unmute yourself. There we go.
All right. So I have a comment about what Michael said about diversity and the trust issue. I think that diversity itself it is a challenge, but also it provides something that people may not readily see. I started with an example. In Taiwan, there are a lot of foreigners that live in Taiwan. And the foreigners, if they are very involved with Taiwanese, they actually see the strengths and weaknesses Taiwanese much better than Taiwanese see themselves. Okay, so that's a strength of diversity. It's when you have people who come from another group, they see you more clearly than you see yourself. And that will be great if each group are willing to talk about their own strengths and weaknesses. And I really believe that, different race, different subcultures, they should be willing to talk about their strengths and weaknesses to increase their own awareness of their problems. And when they know their problems, and they can seek way to improve it. And so some of the great sources of the awareness may be other people who are involved in their group. So I can see that it's a challenge, but it's also a great path to grow the society. That's all.
That's a great comment. Thank you for that. And I think on that note, since it's kind of in response to what Michael said, maybe I want to suggest that we open it up to more of an informal discussion.
Okay. All right. Everybody should be able to unmute themselves for the general discussion. So if you want to join in the general discussion, you can go ahead and unmute yourself. I also want to note that we are at 1 o'clock, which is our usual cutoff time, but I'll leave the meeting open for a while for a general discussion. But we may drop off of Zoom. If anybody's watching on there, I assume Dave will let us know. So yeah, it looks like a bunch of people have just unmuted themselves. So go ahead. And also, one last thing, since we're all, everybody can unmute themselves, we're on Zoom, be careful of talking over each other. With more than one person's talking at the same time, we can't hear anybody. But other than that, go for it.
When you spoke about excuse me, one of the requirements being a diversity of sources of information. It seems like at the present time we may have too much of a diversity. Any stand you take, you can find support for. And it makes it harder for us to leave our own individual bubbles.
I think that's a good comment. And I think that definitely is related to this kind of explosion of technological advances that we've had that make things much more accessible in certain ways to a much broader segment of the population. And it's also created these venues for people to put their own opinions out there into the world to be seen by more people through venues such as YouTube. So yeah, to some degree, I think there is this vast array of choices of information and places that we can go to learn about different things. That introduces the difficulty of discerning perhaps what is fact and what is not, and what is opinion and what is maybe fact, and the difference between truth and fact and where those overlap. That's a very good comment.
Intentional misinformation.
There is unfortunately a plethora of that.
Capitalized intentional misinformation, no less. And you talked about externalities. One of the things I've been talking about lately, I was listening to the talk, but I had some other things to do, so I thought I'd jump in kind of here at the end. One of the things I've been noticing lately is some of these tech companies, I think when you mentioned externalities, one of the externalities of what they're doing, particularly Facebook, and you had mentioned YouTube, is like the spread of misinformation. And, they're able to weaponize, well, maybe monetize misinformation, because you can run an ad for something crazy, right? And so like the companies will monetize that, and then the externalities of that are put on the rest of us to deal with. And I was just wondering if, as far as when you think about externalities, if you had thought about that much, or if you had anything to say about like the externalities of misinformation and the capitalization of information, and maybe even the monopolization of where we get our information from. Because everybody, you said, oh, we have all these sources, but everybody gets their news from Facebook.
Yes, and things that are shared. I think that brings up a really interesting point that I've thought about quite a bit, and I hope that in years to come there will be much more research on, particularly as it relates to democratic society. Facebook in particular, so let's take that as an example of a social network. Right now it is a for-profit corporation, and that really creates this conflict between an incentive to foster open communication and better networking capacity of the people and really foster kind of those democratic ideals. But at the end of the day, as a for-profit corporation, their primary mission is to achieve a profit for shareholders and owners. And so those goals are out of alignment in terms of how they structure their algorithms for what you see on your newsfeed. And as long as profit is the primary incentive and primary goal, I don't know that those types of social networks can really function as a way to improve communication between people, improve the availability of informational resources, because I think there's an inherent conflict there.
And I think there is another point of tension between democracy and capitalism that we did not discuss yet. That generally democracy takes time. So you need time to make your mind, to study the issues, to study your candidates, to vote, and so on. While capitalism, it's competition, right? So every company is interested to get to market as fast as possible. Mm-hmm. And plus these technological advances that create the opportunities for doing things as fast as possible. Mm-hmm. And so people just don't have time to process information and to make decisions and even to adopt psychologically to all this change that capitalism and technology bring to our life. And this creates additional challenges for how our democracy can adjust to this, to so unusual and unprecedented pace of this social and technological and other changes. That we never had anything like this.
I think that's a really great point. And I'm really glad you brought that up because it does highlight this that other dimension of conflict of time. And we have this colloquialism of time is money. And to me, that brings to mind all of these ways that we've kind of tried to incorporate economic theory into how our government runs. And so as a general community, as a society, we've come to understand efficiency under economic terms of trying to maximize how much you can produce in terms of time and resources. But that really undermines democracy on the governance side of things when you try and run government on this conception of efficiency, because it short circuits and it doesn't allow for that time and consideration that's really necessary to be thoughtful about how we implement our policies in a democratic way. Thank you so much for bringing that up.
On the subject of false information on the internet, they've done there's a study I saw recently where they concluded that being well educated does not make you any better at detecting false data. Being politically involved does, but just the education alone is not enough. The other thing they found is if you're liberal, it's easy to spot false data aimed at conservatives, and if you're conservative, it's easy to spot false data aimed at liberals.
I think that might relate to, I think it was a great comment by Emma, if I'm recalling correctly, that diversity really provides that outside view of a group's, really good things about it and also the detriments and the flaws. And I think the same might be true here, where your political affiliation can influence how well you can see and spot misinformation that is aimed at your own political identity versus how well you can spot it when it's aimed at a different political identity.
I agree with this, but only if if people take this effort to talk to each other and to try to listen and trust to each other. So diversity does not have these beneficial effects automatically, just by its presence. So it needs the efforts.
Yeah. I think a lot of this comes down to intentionality and awareness.
Yes. Right? His daughter, huh? Why do you get so black?
I'm curious if anybody has examples of where they've seen some more specific policy examples or economic examples where they've seen this tension between market capitalism and democracy in your own context.
Well, this whole social media, and not only social media, but media in general, the fact that they try to just increase their ratings, and they bring as much and as quickly the information not necessarily verified, sometimes very partisan, just in order to increase their ratings. And this, we used to think that free information, free speech, it's very good for democracy, but in this case, it works against democracy, really. Because it makes difficult for people even to discern facts from fiction, from fake news, whatever.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that is confounded by the economic interests in our free press, because so many press outlets are owned by for-profit corporations, and really they then rely on high ratings, high viewership to stay afloat. And we also have a lot of larger corporations buying up smaller outlets and making it impossible for the smaller news sources to really thrive. And so we're seeing a consolidation in some sense of our media along those lines.
That gets to monopoly in general.
Yeah.
And we can see this not only in media, even in such high-tech sectors as aviation. For instance, take Boeing. How we see how many issues with quality assurance they had. And it's not only with this 737 MAX, but with the other aircraft and with the Starliner spacecraft. So this monopolistic position, it's really detrimental. It can affect safety, and that's. And there are many examples like this. It just more notorious.
I don't know about the acrobats. Unfortunately,
Dana, you're muted. I can see your lips moving, but I can't hear you.
Yeah, so I have a pet peeve, which is the advertising. Advertising is about distorting information, and therefore it has a negative effect both on the economy and in the democracy. I think that's a big one. I would like to see advertising abolished. We have to find a way of allowing people to know about products, but not the way it's done now.
I think that's a great comment. And if you figure out how to do that, let us know.
Well, I mean, one possibility would be to have websites where people could post information about their products, and people who wanted to buy a product could go to the website instead of having the intrusiveness that we have now. Where, I mean, I was watching something a while ago. There was an ad like every 5 minutes on what I was watching. Quite annoying and quite distracting.
But isn't that a way of infringing on someone's speech? Like if I have a post or an ad somewhere, it's my speech. It is a form of speech, isn't it? Like what the Supreme Court rules?
But the problem is that there's a lot of advertising which is quite misleading.
Yes.
Why should we allow basically untruths?
That gets back to regulating advertising and truth in advertising, and that probably needs to be a government role to make sure that advertising is at least somewhat truthful.
That sounds like a ministry of truth.
Yeah, President Trump agrees with your point. He thinks that fake news is bad, and he thinks journalists should be executed.
I wouldn't go that far.
Read the new book.
There's got to be a better way. I'm not saying it's easy, but there's got to be a better way. I suggest everybody. I suggest everybody watch The Century of the Self. It's a BBC 4-part series it's largely about advertising.
The Century of the Self?
The Century of the Self.
Oh, thank you.
It basically is looking at Freud, Sigmund Freud, Anna Freud, and Edward Bernays, who was basically the started PR in this country.
So I remember back when we had network television only, we didn't have cable TV and all that stuff. And
you too.
When they started talking about cable TV, it was going to be you'd have to pay for it, but then there wouldn't be any advertising. And of course, that didn't last very long, if it lasted at all.
Well, we have the same problem with public radio. They originally had no advertising. They would just simply have, this thing is brought to you by such and such, and leave it at that. But those things have expanded, and they're now like mini ads.
I think the same is true of the internet when it was made public. And we've now had it taken over by pop-ups and side ads and things that are unendingly distracting.
And apparently in the early days of television, they talked about all the good things that could happen from television, and a lot of the good things didn't occur. A lot of the bad things did.
Well, Jill, I'd like to thank you for your talk and answers to questions. It's been very informative for me, and I'm sure a lot of other people.
Yes.
And we're glad you were able to join us today.
Well, thank you so much for having me and engaging in such a great discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I like to have more discussions like this.
Yeah, me too. Well, I have to jump off now, but if anybody has any follow-up questions or comments that come to them later, please feel free to email me. And I hope everybody has a great rest of your Sunday.